Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, conferences, and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. Mike is the president of Risen Jesus, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jaros, your host. Mike, on today's episode, I want to cover a section in one of your chapters here on postmodern historians. Now, to me, that comes across as sort of an oxymoron of sorts, but maybe you could first tell us, what does that term mean?
Yeah, well, the modernist would be, we can use methods and so forth to get to the past. It was a historian from years ago that talked about, when we're looking at the past, it's like wir angeblich gewesen, where we want to look at how it actually occurred. And so this is like realist history, it's called, that we want to know how things actually happened. We want to have, certainty that it happened this way. A postmodernist comes along and says, no, we can't have that kind of certainty because there are so many different challenges to the past. We start off with, events happened, but they happen within a certain grid. And that grid involves interpretation. So like 9/11 that happened here in the United States, we interpret it within a certain grid of being attacked by Islamic terrorists, okay? And this is what happened in our country. But the nation of Israel would put it within a little different grid. And they'd say, well, yes, that was a terrorist attack, Islamic terrorists on your nation, but Islamic terrorists have been initiating attacks all over the world. It just finally came to your house. A Muslim over in, let's say, a jihadist in Afghanistan or Pakistan might say that they've got a different narrative. They'd say, these weren't terrorists that did it. These were holy men engaged in jihad in the cause of Islam, the true religion, and they gave their lives for a good cause. So you have these different grids in which the narrative is told. So what actually happened? Because everybody's putting their own spin on it. That'd be one thing. Another thing is, how are we learning about the past? When we talk about Jesus, well, if we're looking at a Jewish leader in that day, say Caiaphas, the high priest who had turned him over to Pilate to have him crucified, he is going to look at the data and explain it differently than, say, one of Jesus' disciples did. And so we are learning about the past. Our only window into the past is through the eyes of specific people. Yep. And they're looking at things from different grids and different horizons. And then you've got the problem of memory, right? That memory is not perfect. We all know that there are occasions where when we don't recall the past accurately. And that's not just with us, it's even with historians. They're also relying on sources who have their own horizons and grids that they're reporting the facts from, and they may not always be accurate. Then, you put all that together, and then even us moderns, we are interpreting them. So we're interpreting others who are interpreting others who are interpreting facts or data. And so you get down to the thing, and the postmodernists are saying, see, we just can't even know the past. We can know just bare facts about the past, but putting together a narrative, there's just too many things you can't know. And then when it comes to Jesus, all right, we might be able to establish he claimed to be divine, but that doesn't mean we can establish he is divine. We can establish, a lot of historians will say, well, we can establish that the disciples claimed and believed that Jesus rose from the dead, but we can't establish that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So there's all these kinds of things that go into the postmodernist history, and so they say, well, anything that we reproduce here is nothing more than historical fiction, the narrative. And we can never know whether that narrative is true. Some may be more true than others, but we don't know if any of it's true. Now, the radical postmodernists are the ones that would deny and say history is just a dead discipline. But they're the radical ones, and most historians haven't followed that way. Yeah.
So, the postmodern historian is one who's just extremely skeptical about discovering facts from history or certain conclusions. But it does seem like, they're not saying we can't know anything, right? So you did say that the postmodern, some would say we can even know that Jesus claimed to be divine.
Right.
So maybe there's a spectrum even from within the postmodernist camp.
Yes, there is.
Whereas, a radical postmodern would say you can't know anything. You can't know what you had for breakfast, which although some of us do have trouble recalling what we had for breakfast.
Well, I can just tell you something. It's not really postmodern, but I lectured at Clemson a couple of years ago, and afterwards some students came up to talk to me, and this one guy said, but, we just really can't know this stuff, and he was giving all these things, and I was dialoguing with him for probably 3-4 minutes, and finally I said, but if we go that far, like what you're going, it seems to me that you couldn't even be certain that we're having a conversation here right now. And he says, well, you're right. Well, we can't. And I said, so then why am I wasting my time? And I turned to the next guy and said, so what's your question? And just left this guy in the dark. Because it's just, I forgot who the scholar is. It might have been Ben Witherington. No, it was Luke Timothy Johnson. He said it can get to the point of cognitive cannibalism.
Yeah.
Again, we can't prove that we weren't just created 5 minutes ago, right? But
yeah, with pre-existing memories and all that.
Right. It'd be ridiculous to think that we were.
Right.
We are rationally justified in believing that we are as old. I think that's called properly basic beliefs in philosophy, right? So, the postmodernist, there's a spectrum. But overall, the majority of historians today have not gone with the postmodernist view. In fact, toward the end of the 20th century, you had a leading light in the postmodern movement. He's in the U.S. His name's Keith Jenkins, and he was saying that the debates have occurred, and pretty much historians go on practicing as though we can know the past. So he was kind of conceding defeat, that they had not won the day in order to convince historians to go the way of postmodernism. Now, that doesn't mean that full realism, to say that wir sind eigentlich gewesen, we can know it, how it actually occurred.
Sure.
That doesn't mean that sort of radical realism is confirmed. Most historians, almost all, are of the opinion that
temper their expectations.
Exactly.
Right. But that's the pursuit, right? The pursuit is trying as best we can to discover as much as we can of what actually happened.
Right. We'll never get there, but that is our pursuit.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because if the postmodernist movement in history had succeeded, it would almost do away with history itself as a discipline.
That's correct.
So that's probably why, at least some guys wanted to keep their jobs or something.
Yeah, well, it is kind of interesting that if postmodernism is true, then their books written by postmodernists become worthless.
Yeah.
And they go for even further, and here's why. They go further, and it's like language itself. We don't, we each have different definitions for words, and what one person means can be interpreted differently from another. And listen, anybody who's married understands that. You're talking to your spouse, and you interpret what they're saying in a certain way, and we misunderstand them. And we are misunderstood on occasion, too. Yeah. We want to be understood, but we misinterpret maybe a facial expression they give or what we perceive as a tone in their voice when they say it, and we misinterpret them. Well, when people are writing, the author wants to be understood.
Right.
And there are
even the postmodernist writer wants to be understood.
That's exactly right. But at the radical postmodernist is correct that language, and I've heard these objections from others, that the language we can't really communicate because, but we have general idea and good enough to be able to understand what another person is saying for the most part.
Yep. All right, good. So that's sort of one response to the postmodernist view that it's in a sense self-defeating. What are some other ways we can reply and realize some of the shortcomings of that view?
Well, I remember one, I think it was Thomas Haskell. It might have been someone else, but someone wrote, and I'm trying to go back to what I remember writing back in 2009, and it gets published, it was 10 years ago. And they talk about a map, or, so you get two travelers, they're in France, and they get lost in the country, and they're trying to find their way to Paris. And they come across a farmer, a vineyard worker, and said, hey, we got this map here, but we don't know where we are on this map. Okay, so how do we get to Paris? And he looks at the map and he says, this is all wrong. This is all wrong. I mean, look at the countryside here. It's just pastel green here. It doesn't, look at the beautiful countryside that we have here with the vineyards and the aroma from the flowers and the sound of the birds. And that is not at all accurately represented on this map. And then you come to look at Paris with all of its culture and the great wine and the great food and the great people. And it's just represented by a black dot with a slim line around it. That's not Paris. That's not at all what Paris looks like. So I can't help you at all. So what the lesson we learned from this is you don't have to be precise or exhaustive in what you're giving in order to communicate things, because we all know we can get places from maps. All he had to do was point to basically where they were at, and they could get to Paris from there. Yeah. Maps work. So you shouldn't judge a map by the criteria that we're going to use for judging other things like history or biography. Then you're making a categorical mistake there.
Right.
But we want to be understood. We don't have to be exhaustive in our descriptions what we are looking for in history is to find an essentially faithful representation or an accurate gist. That's what we're looking for. Good. That's our expectations. And then when we get it, we know we hold it provisionally. We're holding it with an open hand, saying it could be otherwise, that there may be some data, some artifacts or documents that pop up in the future that show us that the conclusions we have arrived at are mistaken, and then we're forced to revise our conclusions.
Good. Let me ask you this. Is there anything good that can come from Nazareth? Or rather, is there anything good about the postmodern historian category?
Yes, certainly. We do, as I mentioned a moment ago, we do attempt to try to get back to the past, to describe it as closely and as fully as possible. But the fact that historians are select in what they report, so what we are getting from the Gospels, of course, or any ancient biography or history, is not everything. As you pointed out previously, John chapter 21 says, if everything Jesus did was reported, all the world couldn't contain all the books. So there's many more things. Just think about your life. You're 31 years old. And if you were to write an exhaustive biography of everything you've said and did, it would take 31 years to read, right? You can't do that. So if we were to write a biography of Kurt Jaros for the first 31 years of his life, we would be very select in the things that we, report. So that's what every biographer does, and we're not reporting every word, every detail of the conversation. So we can't expect everything that is being reported about Jesus to be exhaustive, and some editing has taken place in order to give us a gist of what was going on. The postmodernists remind us of this, so that we realize that what we are reading, even in the Gospels, is not exactly how things actually happen, at least in many of the cases. It's certainly leaving out a lot of details, and may not be exactly how the things happened. There may be editing in there in order to communicate more clearly certain points.
Conway Wong asks this. I recently heard the podcast on Christian apologetics and why some Christian scholars actually don't like to get involved in apologetics. I'd like to hear more on that. Is it a "this is going to hurt my academic reputation" thing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Conway. There could be a number of different reasons for that. There are some camps of scholars, and apologetics is just a bad word. But you have people like Bart Ehrman, who is a bona fide scholar, and he does just the opposite, which is being an iconoclast. So just as an apologist is trying to defend a certain position, an iconoclast is trying to tear it down. So, it cuts both ways. So they would say, well, there's an agenda behind it. And to an extent, I think such concern is legitimate. When I come to the it's funny, with my book on Plutarch and the Gospels, Gospel Differences, I've been criticized from both sides. So I have a skeptic that says I was trying to defend the Gospels, and I have an evangelical saying I'm trying to tear the Gospels down. So the horizons are in, right?
Yeah.
But they think that if I'm doing things that might bolster the Gospels, that I'm being an apologist. Well, when I wrote the book, I can say that my motives behind it was to understand, and doing the research, was to understand what we are reading in the Gospels. And the book does not defend the reliability of the Gospels. It doesn't tear down the reliability of the Gospel. It's not even a question that's being asked. It's, why are these differences in the Gospels? We ask the wrong question. It's like, typically Christians will say, how do we reconcile these differences? How do we harmonize these differences? Where I think the better question is, why are these differences here to begin with? And so I wanted to understand the whole thing about how ancient history or biography was written. So that's what I was doing with the book. Now, in the end, I do say that, for one thing two things it has revealed to the Christian, the conservative Christian, we have to be careful that we're not reading our own desires for how we want the Gospels to be written with modern precision, how biographies are written in the 21st century. We need to be careful not to read that into how they were written in the first century. We can misread them in that way. And that can make Christians feel uncomfortable. For the skeptic, to say that the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory, I think we've laid that to rest, that they are not. If you look at them and take into consideration the compositional devices. So I wasn't trying to be an apologist there. When I was going through my study on the resurrection, I wasn't trying to be an apologist. I was really trying to get the truth and the bottom line, because I'm trying to find truth. An apologist, on the other hand, is trying to take conclusions and use it for a purpose of defending. Now, for me, if my conclusions can work for apologetics, then I want to use it, because I believe Christianity is true and I want to defend the faith. But when I'm doing my research, I'm not doing it for apologetics.
Right. Yeah, you could come at your research without being a Christian, and then you'll be led to a conclusion there versus having the conclusion in mind for, defending in public. So
yeah, it's a matter of really trying to manage your horizon, your bias, and to take your desired outcome and do your best to lay it aside while your investigation proceeds, so you can do that investigation with integrity. And I can tell you this, it's not easy. It is not easy. But that's, if you're a researcher, which I consider myself a researcher, and I'm dealing with these questions, then I want to deal with them as a serious student of the New Testament without apologetics in mind. If I can use the conclusions for apologetics, fantastic. If I can't, then I can't. Does that make sense? An apologist is doing it, though, with the objective.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that, but that's not what a researcher does.
Yep. And you said, being a researcher can be a difficult task, but with the method in place, it makes it easier to make light of one's horizons and assumptions and conclusions and all that. So, great. Thank you, Mike. If you want to learn more about the work and ministry of Dr. Mike Licona, you can go to his website, risenjesus.com, where you can find authentic answers to genuine questions about the resurrection of Jesus and the historical reliability of the Gospels. There you can check out some great resources like ebooks, articles, videos, audio, and the like. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, would you consider becoming one of our monthly supporters? You can do so at risenjesus.com/donate. Be sure to like Dr. Licona on Facebook, follow him on Twitter, subscribe to his YouTube channel, and subscribe to this podcast as well on iTunes and the Google Play Store. This has been the Risen Jesus Podcast, a ministry of Dr. Mike Licona.